of this webinar is really to answer the question, what needs to happen in schools to do better in responding to sex trafficking of girls of color, understanding what some of the unique vulnerabilities might be for girls of color, understanding how we come together as a collective educational community to present a safe space for girls who are at risk of commercial sex trafficking, and again, what it is we need to know as educators in this space. Joining us today will be individuals who have done great work in this space, pioneering work in this space. And I'm so pleased that they're able to join us. Nola Brantley is the CEO and founder of Nola Brantley Speaks. You may have her full bio. She has worked in this space as a powerful survivor voice and has been a strong advocate and trainer and technical assistance provider in this space, and approaches this work with a great degree of integrity and love. Holly Joshi is a national trainer and court-qualified trafficking expert who has almost 2 decades of public service experience and who's been engaged in this work from the vantage point of law enforcement as well as service and advocacy work. She shares this space here in the Bay Area with Nola Brantley, having done some pioneering work with girls who are survivors of commercial sex trafficking. Tovi Scruggs Hussein is the co-founder of Truth Educational Consulting and Services, who is an educator, an author, an award-winning urban high school principal. And so she brings very practical experience and insight as to how schools can better respond to our girls of color who are at high risk of school pushout as in association with commercial sex trafficking. And we have Kyla Woods, who is a youth advisor associated with the center, who believes that schools can become a safe place for students who are struggling in their personal lives, and believes that faculty can also provide insight that the students may not have yet considered. And so I'm going to stop talking and let us get to the work. And I appreciate all of you who are on. Grateful to have had the opportunity to greet you with these bios. And so let's get to work.
Excellent. Thank you, Dr. Morris, for always showing up and being here to support us and get us in the proper framework to begin doing this work. And with that, we are going to start with Nola, who is going to give us a fantastic introduction overview on policy and advocacy in regards to sex trafficking. Hello, Nola.
Okay, good morning, or good afternoon, should I say. Can everybody hear me? Okay, great. Awesome. So thank you for having me be part of this webinar. It's great. So I'm going to dive right in. I'm going to define what we're really talking about here when we're talking about sexual exploitation or commercial sexual exploitation of Black girls, of girls across the board. And I do come at this work, as Dr. Morris said, as both a subject matter expert that's been working in this field for over a decade, has been a co-founder and executive director of a direct service agency that has served this population, but also as a survivor of the commercial sex industry myself as a child who was in school at the time that I was recruited and brought into the commercial sex industry. And then I was trafficked the last 2 years of my high school career. And it was through a program that I was involved in at school that I met my trafficker. And so I'll talk a little bit more about that as I get into the definitions. So when we're talking about sexual exploitation, and many of the children who are commercially sexually exploited first start off being sexually exploited, and even to go further back, and we'll look at this continuum soon, many of them, even before being sexually exploited, are child sexual abuse victims. And so we do have a lot of opportunities to intervene when we're looking at school, because this happens on a continuum. And many of the child sexual abuse cases start much, much earlier on at an elementary school age. So with sexual exploitation, you have a kid that has some basic need going unmet. It could be food, clothing, shelter. It can also be love and attention and supervision. And you have an adult that sees that need and uses that as an opportunity to have a sexual relationship with that kid. That can look like a homeless kid who's living on the streets and someone's offering them a place to sleep. And that can look like a 14-year-old girl with a 28-year-old boyfriend who's also giving her rides to school, giving her lunch money, and buying her school clothes. So this can look many different ways. It's not necessarily a direct, I'm going to buy you some clothes and you're going to have sex with me. But at the end of the day, when you have a 28-year-old having sex with a 14-year-old or a 12-year-old child, that's what's going on when there is that basic need that needs to be met. As we look at the commercial sexual exploitation of children, we get into another component of it. And in this component, you have 3 people.
Is this?
I hear someone speaking in? No? Okay, so in this component, you have a third component involved. So with sexual exploitation, you have the child and the person that's taking advantage of them to meet their basic need. But when you have commercial sexual exploitation, you have a third person making a profit. So now you have the child who's the victim. You have someone who's having sex with the child and paying either the child or a third party. And then you have the person who's benefiting financially and who also often is also sexually abusing the child, because they understand that many of these children were sexually abused during earlier childhood. So there's a love, sex, abuse linkage. So in terms of, my own story, I was a 10th grader in high school. I was in advanced placement classes. I worked in the dean's office. My sex trafficker was a police officer that was connected to a diversion program that worked with my high school that I was part of and that I was thriving in. But, even though I was doing good in school in lots of ways, there were lots of risk factors that people should have noticed, especially given how involved I was in my school community, in clubs, working in the office. I had a gross lack of attention and supervision, and I stayed at the school for any waking hours I could. That's a sign. I know that now because my daughter, who has, a great life, wants to run home, when it's time to come home. I had this sexual abuse history, and that showed up in a lot of different ways that, I can't cover in this time, but I will say if teachers across the country got proper training on childhood sexual abuse and not just a pamphlet handed to them, it would allow them the knowledge and information to spot earlier childhood sexual abuse, which many of these kids have experienced. I also was really lacking love and acceptance and attention. I was 13 the first time my mom said she loved me. So anyone giving me that love, whether it was a teacher or a sex trafficker, I was open to it. It just happened to be the sex trafficker. And I came from a community that was plagued with poverty and violence, and there just wasn't enough conversations in my classrooms about how poverty and violence impacts people and how it impacts communities, especially with me being an honor student myself and being in advanced placement classrooms. Those discussions just weren't happening, at least not at my school. So, many children are impacted by the commercial sex industry, especially Black girls, especially youth of color, especially youth that have been in the foster care system. Our LGBTQ youth are at an increased risk, and we'll talk a little bit about them more, our undocumented youth, as well as our youth who have cognitive disabilities. And the issue of choice has always been a big issue on the table around whether people in the sex industry, who on average enter as children, make a choice. And they do make a choice, but it's not to be sex trafficked or to be sexually abused. They make a choice to eat. They make a choice to have shelter. They make a choice to be loved and accepted and feel like they're part of a family. And so those choices oftentimes lead to their victimization, unfortunately, given their set of vulnerabilities. If you look at Gina's story here, Gina's family has always struggled financially. She's lived in the inner city all her life. It's hard for her at school, especially the beginning of the school year when her friends have new clothes and new school supplies. I can relate to that like Gina. I was that kid. And that was part of how the trafficker seduced me and enticed me, was by providing things for me that my family just couldn't afford to provide, including school clothes. I never got new school clothes until I was in my trafficking situation. Gina's lucky if she gets the hand-me-downs that don't have holes. Some days it's hard to even focus on schoolwork because she's so hungry. I can relate to that. There were periods of times that I went to school completely starving, and that should have been noticed because of the way that I functioned around food and in the cafeteria and whatnot. So there are definitely signs. And just like Gina became vulnerable to someone buying her a burger, I, in the same way, was vulnerable when the police officer recruited me from the school. So it's really important that we recognize these vulnerabilities. Whenever you have a kid that's vulnerable, not having basic needs met, not getting the attention or love that they need, it usually shows out in some kind of behavior that we may classify as acting out. So any behavior that you may see as acting out, we need to look at a little bit more closely, and especially as we think about different biases and our different exposure or comfort to different racial groups like Black girls, and what we interpret as acting out when it can really be a Black girl that's in distress. Black girls are overrepresented in foster care. There's an increased number of even Black boys being identified as victims in major cities across the country in terms of the commercial sex industry. And then we have to look at the historical context of Black females in our country and how, dating back to slavery, Black female sexuality has been exploited. They've been looked at as insatiable sexual animals. All these excuses have been given about who they are, and making them less than the white woman or than any woman as an excuse to do horrible things to them throughout history and still now today. And so that impacts how we all look at Black girls, and even how Black girls look at themselves, even how I look at myself. And if we're not willing to explore those biases and that historical context, then we can treat Black girls in a way that continues to enforce that narrative. If you look at how sexual abuse of Black girls and even of Black people during slavery feeds into the history of sexual abuse, and then how the sexual abuse of children is on this continuum that can then lead to sexual exploitation, and then the commercial sex industry, it helps you understand even more why so many Black girls are victims of the commercial sex industry, because it starts with sexual abuse, which has happened to the Black community in mass numbers collectively. So we really have to think about how race and racism play a role in sexual abuse, in us identifying sexual abuse, in sex trafficking, and in the risky behaviors of many Black girls that then lead to the commercial sex industry. I've seen a lot of microaggressions throughout the years with Black girls who are either at risk for sex trafficking or who have already been sex trafficked and are returning to school in their classrooms. Everything ranging from responses and reactions to their physical appearance that are completely inappropriate, not trauma-informed at all, a lacking of concern or compassion or understanding when they're coming into the classroom distressed or depressed, and that behavior is being misinterpreted as unmotivated or lazy, which relates directly back to attitudes and thoughts about Black folks post-slavery that were just untrue. The perception that they're always guilty when something happens. So this idea of being guilty by Blackness, this is something Black girls experience a lot, and it's very discouraging in the educational setting. They also experience harsher discipline, and discipline when there should be concern and compassion. They also experience harsher grading of their work and a minimizing of their potential and ideas, and even of their vision of where they can go in the future. And I'm so glad that we have a lot of Black women now in a current society that provides examples for Black girls so that they can't be told who they can't be, because they can see who they can be now. So that's great. And having those examples alive in your classroom, if they're not in your text, is critical. There's also this assumption that Black girls who are victims of the commercial sex industry in some way are involved because they want to be involved, like they're making a choice. And that dates back to ideas about Black female sexuality and Black women overall. And so it's important that, again, we're checking our biases so that we don't find ourselves, not doing our best job with our students based on things that, that we have learned or that we were even born into, right? Not things that we want to hold in our heart. Our LGBTQ youth experience a lot of discrimination in school, so I want to highlight them. And they're also at high risk for the commercial sex industry and sexual exploitation, because they experience homelessness at rates that are so much higher than our average youth population. They also experience a lot of things in school that lead to them leaving school or being unsafe in school. So we want to make sure we're really talking to them, checking on them, and also having discussions in the classroom about these students so that they don't have to go to school like Janet Mock did and feel tortured and feel like they're being names. And so it's really important that we consider that. And so thank you for giving me this time to provide this overview. There was a handout provided on the laws and policies. So you can reference that for some of the laws and policies that have happened across the state. But in California and in many other states across the nation, we have safe harbor laws that further protects these children. And the original law is in our Traffic and Victims Protection Act that protects them. So you can refer to that, and even some of the tribal areas that have laws in place, it will break that down for you too. So thank you for this time.
Thank you
Excellent.
so much, Nola. I'm Rebecca Epstein. I'm here as the Executive Director of the Center on Poverty and Inequality at Georgetown Law, and we're here co-hosting the webinar with the National Black Women's Justice Institute. I want to turn things over to Kyla Woods, one of our youth advisors, to ask a question of our panelists.
Hi, guys. So first of all, I just want to thank Nola for, first of all, just sharing your story, but also being so intentional about it. It's just amazing. But I do want to ask, from each of your perspectives, why do you, I can kind of guess for Nola, but I don't want to assume, why did you get into the work, and what do you feel needs to happen in schools to see an effective change?
So for me, people often assume I got into the work because I'm a survivor, but the trip is that there was no language for this stuff. So I didn't even know I was a survivor. The work is what helped me to understand I was a survivor. And I meet women sometimes now that are 80 years old that are survivors, and they don't know until I break it down for them. So I really got into this work because it was an issue impacting the city of Oakland, where I'm from, and I'm not born there. I'm born in San Francisco, but I consider myself from Oakland. And I love that city. And it was really impacting children there. And then when I found out, like in the beginning of doing this work, 85% of the kids that I talked to who were victims, they were in foster care. So I was like, oh, wait a minute. These are kids who already don't have, necessarily families that are able to care for them for one reason or the other. And now they're being sex trafficked. This is like one of the most desperate situations I've seen domestically.
And see, I assumed incorrectly, so.
So can we hear from Holly Josie, this answer to the same question about how you got into the work and what we can do?
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. Just to all the participants, I want to say thank you for coming. Nelson Mandela said that you judge the heart and soul of a country by the way in which we treat our young people. So I think that you joining us today says a lot about your heart and soul, so thank you. Unfortunately, the fact that we have to be here today also says a lot about the deep, deep soul work we need to do as a nation and as a world to protect our girls. The reason I got into the work really was by happenstance. I was working at the Oakland Police Department as an undercover police officer. I was very young. I was from the city of Oakland. I did not look like a police officer, so I was quickly adopted into specialized units to do undercover police. One day, I was mainly focused on violent crime, gun trafficking in the city, etc. And I hadn't engaged with what I thought at that time was prostitution related work. I had no interest in it. In fact, I was purposely avoiding it because I'd had family experiences within the sex trade and my own personal experiences with the sex trade as a youth. And I wasn't interested in dealing with anything that I thought was prostitution related. But one day I was walking in the hallway and a supervisor basically told me that I was going to participate in an undercover prostitution operation. He gave me the clothes. He told me to go stand out on International Boulevard, which is a notoriously violent open air sex trade market in Oakland. And so I went out there thinking that I was working on misdemeanor offenses between two consenting adults and really having this bad attitude about even needing to be there. And about 2 or 3 hours into the shift, I looked across the street and I saw 2 14-year-old girls. And I realized in that moment that I was nervous about being out on a street track, and I had a gun and a badge and officers around the corner to back me up, and a wire and all of the things that I needed to keep myself safe. And I was playing pretend. And these 2 14-year-old girls were this was their real life. And as far as I could see, no one was looking for them. And so really that understanding changed the course of my career and then changed the course of my life. And I've just committed my life to understanding what's going on, working with survivors, working with other advocates, and just really utilizing my power, my privilege, my seats at the table to push what I see as one of the most pressing human rights abuses in modern history forward. And I think, you know, what's important in my opinion for schools to remember when engaging the work is that human trafficking is one manifestation of oppressions and you know, inequity. It's a very hugely important issue and one that we've all committed our lives to, but to remember that it's not the issue, right? And so like if we're having an anti-trafficking response in schools and in society, that really needs to be an equity agenda. Because as Nola has already highlighted, and as you know, Dr. Morris writes about and frames her work around, like this is really an equity issue. And so for everything that, you know, we're going to further discuss in terms of strategies for schools, I think it's really important to remember that this is impacting the most vulnerable among us. And for vulnerable populations, it's really impossible to separate individual trauma from the political, right? And so making sure that whatever we are trying to move forward is connected to and grounded in an understanding, whether it's, you know, the mental models of teachers, whether it's the curriculum that we're designing in school, whether it's whatever programming we're pushing forward to try and help girls, is really understanding that it has to be rooted in collective healing and an understanding that this is really larger than like an individual's experience of trauma and violence. And I'll stop there for now.
Thank you. Can we hear from Toby on the same question about how you got into the work and what needs to be done?
Can you hear me, Rebecca?
Now I can.
Great. I just had an issue with my audio. So thank you, everyone. I really echo the sentiments that Holly and Nola have expressed around the importance of this call and how critical the work is. And when I reflect back on why I got into this work, it stems more for me from a basis and foundation of being trauma informed, and also my experience as a Black girl, becoming a Black young woman, becoming a Black woman in the world of education. And when I look back at my high school years, I went to Inglewood High, and there were students that dressed as what we might call girls today. There were boys that walked around in full suits and briefcases. And at that time, the lifestyle of sex trafficking for young girls, in my experience in high school, was being glorified. And these students were coming to school. Teachers were not getting involved. Adults were not getting involved. They were treating themselves like a business. And that was the experience that I first remember really noticing that sex trafficking was happening. And I didn't have language for it then. I just knew that it looked like the girls were complicit and being part of this economy that they needed. When I was 14 years old, my mother died of AIDS. And that was really traumatic for me. And I remember going to school the very same day. And as I went through my career in school, I was seeing the ways that Black girls were treated, the way that our behaviors were interpreted as being loud, as being sexualized, as little women, basically, and not as girls that needed support and direction. As I went into my teaching career, it became really evident that there was a cultural disconnect between understanding not just Black girls, but Black children and other children of color, and the level of whiteness of our education system and the level of whiteness of our teachers. The whiteness doesn't make white people wrong. The whiteness just simply feeds the cultural disconnect that really makes it challenging for educators to have a quality connection with a lot of students. Because when the issue of race comes up, or when people's own biases come up, often, because white people don't have to engage in race as consistently as people of color do, they lack a certain racial stamina. And the stress response they have related to racialized interactions is actually the same as an induced trauma response in a lot of ways, where it's the same physiology, the same mental, the same emotional response. And so it really led me to some of the framework that I have that I sent out in the article to you all around how critical it is that we as educators must take responsibility and ownership for our own healing and resilience so that we can better serve our students. The way that we respond internally is really the outward effect that we're having on our students, particularly Black girls, Black students, students that are Latino, and it impacts our academic outcomes. When we are not fully serving the students that we serve, it's impacting academic outcomes. It's impacting student wellness. It's impacting their quality of life and their quality of a lived experience of what we call school, which should truly be one of the most beautiful experiences of a child's life. I can wait to go into some of the interventions and ways to remedy this, or I can go into that now. Rebecca, what would you like?
Johanna, I think that you were going to speak next. Go ahead.
Well, first of all, I just want to thank our presenters for really being vulnerable and sharing their truth, because I think that it really does provide a context around why this is such an important topic to really be sharing and providing information around, that we really need to be able to be intentional about making sure that we are caring for these communities. So I'm really, really thankful that our presenters are being so honest and transparent and vulnerable in this moment. And I just want to send it over to Kyla, because she does have yet another question. And Kyla, we just need you to unmute your microphone.
Sorry. I really wanted to know how you ladies believe that schools can interact and really but how can they intervene? How people could reach out and say to that, hey, what's going on? And also do it in a way sorry guys, my connection is a little choppy. About that, guys. But yeah, maybe Noah, you can start. Can you hear me, guys?
Okay, sure. So I couldn't completely hear the question, but I'm gonna just guess that you're asking what are some of the things we can do. Yes? Okay, great. So so in terms of some of the things that we can do, I think one of the things that teachers can do, and
how can teachers interact with that student? How can we say,
Kyla, we're having trouble hearing you. So Nola, why don't you go ahead and answer it as best you can from what we were able to hear.
Can you repeat the question, please?
I
couldn't hear her, I'm sorry.
Okay, well, I guess the most pertinent question for our attendees are how can schools support trafficking prevention efforts and things to consider in terms of programming and framing their approach.
Okay, so I would say because this is an issue of a continuum of sexual abuse, I want to say that one of the things that schools can do, and I know that sometimes it's hard systemically, so I think if not systemically, we do it school by school, we start somewhere, right, is sexual abuse training for teachers. I know it's not that teachers don't want to be able to identify. Many teachers can't identify. I've talked to lots of teachers across the state, and I've talked to them about their sexual abuse training. They say it's a pamphlet. I had some teachers that have gotten permission from their principals to like host a training that teachers can come to if they want to. That's like a live and in-person training where they can really break it down. And they have had teachers that have come on their own time and just being grateful that this teacher has put it together for them. I've actually partnered with a teacher before to help them add some slides on the commercial sex industry. So like at a school level or at a local level, we have to get trained on being able to identify signs of sexual abuse. We don't want to wait until they're being sex trafficked. We want to be able to identify signs of sexual abuse and start to intervene at that time. And if you look at that continuum, you know, once we do find out they've been sexually abused, we know the areas that are impacted. We know that they link love, sex, and abuse. They have their boundaries violated. They get full of guilt and shame. They begin to see themselves as sexual objects, and it impacts their self-esteem. So we have a roadmap on how to stop it from going any further than what has already happened. So I think that is a big part. And I think another piece would be having prevention education in place, which I know in some states like California has become law. So making sure that schools are actually implementing it. Because I know law is nothing but words on paper if people aren't advocating for the implementation and people really understanding, especially in inner city schools where there's high rates of sex trafficking occurring, that this is nothing to be taken lightly. You know, when I worked direct services with kids, every year a child that I was working with was murdered. So we don't want this to be happening to kids. Once they get to this place, it gets really dark. So if we can prevent it by either identifying childhood sexual abuse early on or making sure that prevention education that's been legislated is being implemented, I think those are two very strong things we can do. And then just with Black girls overall, I would just echo what's already been said by everybody. Like, this is about how we treat Black girls in school, not just when they're being sexually abused or sex trafficked, but every single day.
Thank you so much. We're going to get ready to turn it to our attendees, but first I want to allow our other answer have any response.
This is Toby. I'm more than happy to address some of that. Along with what Nola has said, I think it's important too that we think about two areas. One is sometimes girls are in juvenile sex trafficking and we're catching them in that moment and can't necessarily, we don't always have the means to extricate them from what's happening with them. And so when I think about sometimes what our students are going through, it's not necessarily that we're enabling what's happening, but sometimes we simply have to validate what their current experience is. And so, for instance, I offer that, my high school, we had some hygiene kits. Like, we knew girls were coming to school from working or from the experience. We would sometimes have a change of clothes on hand in different sizes because the girls sometimes would be coming to school from working and it would not be dress code appropriate. So there were instances when I felt really torn that I wanted to, in a sense, shake them and try to get them out of this situation. But at the same time, I'm trying to keep a communication with them, a level of connection with them. And so I'm providing some of the things that they need along the way as a school leader.
And that's called harm reduction. You're providing harm reduction.
Thank you. And really tapping into myself emotionally to be sure that my affect is saying that you're not wrong and not making this girl feel wrong. And so the work, again, that goes back to the only way out is in, is the work I had to do on myself to present as that caring adult when I could have been riddled with judgment, when I could have been wanting to go into some other places to get this problem remedied or to fix this for this girl. Making sure that they're getting health services and having a higher touch with this on-site health support that we had, the consistency for that needed to be increased. And then when we were when we were making referrals to different community agencies, it wasn't about giving them a piece of paper and saying, go call. I had to work with counselors to say, no, we're going to call while this student's in the office. We're not going to just make the referral. We're going to connect this referral to the outside support services to make sure that that comfortability for that girl goes up, to be sure that they've already connected with that agency so that when they do connect on their own, the connection's already been made. And so there's a level of comfortability there. In terms of any kind of prevention or providing a better experience, we've got to start normalizing conversations about this, about race, about this issue. We have to provide the vehicles for that. And much like Nola said, that teachers would take on providing trainings in this area. I didn't have enough professional development time with my staff. That's an ongoing issue in schools nationwide. So I started offering what I called article talks. And I would get teachers together every 2 weeks around an article or a topic that was interesting to them. We would be in a classroom for an hour, and it was about people coming to talk about the topic as they felt it was relevant or important. And it would started to build momentum because people want to talk about these things, but don't really have a lot of time. But teachers give of a lot of their own time. So just by simply giving it a 1 hour framework, providing some refreshments, and getting us all in the same room, we were able to start having these conversations. We would make a poster that was like, this was the topic. These were the aha moments around this topic. And I put that poster up above the copy machine. So when teachers were making their copies and doing things in the workroom, they were able to read about the conversations we were having and seeing that it was a safe place. It was not a gotcha. It was not one more thing to do, but they were able to work out some of the challenges that they were having that were showing up in their classrooms that they were able to deal with differently. Definitely acknowledging whiteness and white fragility for our teachers from a place of compassion is just critical. Again, their own white fragility is creeping up in a way that does not allow them to have a compassionate and appropriate response to children of color. And we have got to be explicit about that. That goes with the bias training. And then overall culture climate work. How are we having a school culture that is around caring and connection? So the trauma-informed academic work has to happen, as well as mindfulness practices, some movement around yoga and processing trauma. So things that help our emotional well-being for both adults and students. And definitely girls support groups, girls groups, clubs on campus, really having a space for girls to be and to talk. And I cannot say enough about what Nola said around the behavior piece and being trained to pay attention to behavior. In my trauma workshops, I stress behavior is communication. Behavior is communication. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Really thoughtful response. Holly, did you have before we allow attendees to ask their own questions? I just wanted to give you that opportunity.
Yeah, thank you. And I'll be very brief because I think what Nola and Tovi have said is so rich and so spot on. The only thing that I would add really are three things. Is when we're talking about centering girls and centering the experiences of girls, particularly Black girls and marginalized girls in school, I think it's great that we're starting here. I think it's really important to build partnerships and relationships with professionals who have expertise and experience, and that can help to mold our responses. I also think it's really important to actually center girls and ask them, right? We can ask Black girls. And I think that Monique Morris does that in her work. You know, we've done it fairly well inside Oakland Unified School Districts recently, doing YPAR, youth participatory action research. It can be a very small YPAR project. It can just be surveys. It can be focus groups. But in my opinion, asking the girls at that school site or within that school district what they need and what they're experiencing gives us the richest information, because they really are the experts in their own lives. And when we start to build relationships of trust in youth work, I think sometimes we're talking about trust, and what trust means to us is that we are being trustworthy as adults, but it doesn't necessarily mean that we're also trusting young people. And in all of our relationships, trust has to be mutual. And so in order to demonstrate that and to have authentic relationships with young people, we have to be extending the olive branch, not just asking them to trust us and focusing on our own trustworthiness, but understanding that we can trust them too, and that they understand their experiences better than anyone does. And that if given the space and the supports, they can come up with the solutions in collaboration with us. So I think research is important, and that research has to be driven and done in collaboration with young people. So just asking girls. The other thing I would say is making sure that in our healing processes and in the programs that we're building out to support healing, that we understand that for vulnerable populations, the ability to be empowered through civic engagement is a part of healing. Again, going back to the understanding that for most people that are experiencing trafficking, it's deeper than just their individual experiences of trauma, and that they've already experienced collective trauma. They've already experienced environmental trauma, systemic and historical trauma, etc. So knowing that part of the solution then also has to involve empowerment from a position where they are able to engage civically and act on the environmental and the social issues that have contributed to their situations of vulnerability. If we don't actually add that lens in, then it becomes a situation in which it's really about pathologizing and victim blaming, and our girls tend to internalize oh, this was really about my choices, or it was about my family's negative situation, as opposed to really being able to have an understanding of the social situations and then being able to act collectively on those social situations. And then the last thing, also just doing a deep dive into our curriculum and making sure that the curriculum in the classroom is supporting girls of color and marginalized groups' experiences. I can't stress that enough. And then the very last thing, I think we've already spoke on it briefly, is the punitive disciplinary practices and really evaluating those, but specifically with a focus on how we're interacting with law enforcement in our schools. And if law enforcement is present in your school district, making sure that there are some parameters around that. I mean, there needs to be a very strong memorandum of understanding. Their roles in the school needs to be very well spelled out and understood by teachers, by them, and then they need training as well. Because coming from 15 years worth of law enforcement experience, law enforcement has really important roles to play and a lot of contact with young people, but they don't have the right mental models nor training to do it in a way that's trauma informed. And so I think that if you have to have law enforcement in your school at this time, which I don't think is a good model, and the research is pointing to that, but if that's where we are, then I think that we need to make sure that there are parameters, understandings, memorandums of understanding, and training that's going along with that relationship.
Thank you. Those are really, I appreciate your point about school resource officers, especially from your perspective. So we do want to open the floor to our attendees to ask questions. You can use the chat box. You can use the raise your hand feature. So far, we haven't gotten any questions. So while we're waiting for those questions, you might see it in the chat box that Becca Shapiro has invited everyone to type questions. Kyla, I think you had something to share. Just make sure to unmute yourself. If your audio is coming in through the phone, you just need to unmute your phone. I think you just did it. Oh.
Because I was muted by the host. Okay, can you guys hear me now? Thank you so much. Okay, so I was going to just ask, because as a survivor, so many of the things that you ladies have said from Nola, Togi, and Holly have really just jumped out at me, especially with the idea of being in school. I wasn't trafficked during my high school experience, but shortly after, and I was in high school during the time where I formed a relationship or rapport with my trafficker, even though I wasn't necessarily being trafficked at that time. But you think back to, and me and Rebecca were talking about this about a week ago, about the very small messages that you are given as a Black woman, a Black girl in school, should I say, just about being loud or being told that your voice carries, and how that affects your self-esteem. Just for being, I believe that it's why someone was able to tell me you're stupid or you're this and you're that. And I said, okay, all right, yep. And just kind of took their word for it, because these are messages that I had been receiving in some form my entire life. So to ask a question, I just want to know how you ladies think that we can, because training is great, and I deeply hope that teachers are able to form compassion directly through that. But how do you think that schools would be better to deal with these situations when that doesn't happen? Do you guys have any ideas of maybe interacting from an administrative level to kind of speak with teachers and offer that moment of recognition?
Do any of you have a response? You can go ahead and unmute your microphone and go ahead.
Kyla, can you clarify a bit on how you're seeing that differently from some of the connections from earlier?
There have been many. Sorry, Zoom again. There have been so many times where I just feel.
Kyla, we're having problems with your audio, I'm sorry to say.
Okay, guys.
There you go. You got it. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. I keep getting like the, okay. All right, thanks, guys. But to clarify, I just wanted to know, when you, like as an administrator, when you come into contact with a teacher who you notice, or maybe a coach or someone who you see has these biases that are affecting the way that they're teaching these young women or responding directly to their action, how do you mitigate it in that moment, kind of reaffirming that young lady hasn't done anything wrong?
Often for me, that's a hard one, but I would definitely, I would play more of a neutral role. And I remind both that I'm there to serve them both, because I truly am. And generally I follow up with a teacher afterwards, because it's not, it doesn't serve the relationship just because of the power dynamic that's at play, which it often is, to, in a sense, overly correct a teacher in the presence of a student. So I would generally work to de-escalate the situation by pausing the situation, connecting with the student, getting the student to either where they need to be or get them back on track. And I would also be doing that with the teacher, saying, you know, is there anything that we can come to agreement in this moment about how to perhaps keep the student in class, what the student needs to do, and can we check in later on some strategies?
Okay. And I misspoke and I didn't. Sorry.
So Kyla, I think
Great.
you're having some problems with your audio, and what I'd like to do, Kyla.
Well, I keep getting.
We have a. Sorry, go ahead.
I keep getting a notification that says, like, when I am able to speak, it says unmuted by the host. So maybe I'm getting automatically muted. But maybe someone has a question, though, we can kind of move on.
Okay, well, we do have a question from Marie Dietrich. I wanted to invite you, Marie, to unmute yourself. You can come on camera if you'd like to ask your question directly. If not, I can read it aloud, but I just want to give you a moment. This is just an opportunity to engage directly with our presenters if you'd like to. Marie's question was, what can school staff do differently to prevent sex trafficking, particularly white folks? So any of our presenters can go ahead and unmute themselves to address that question.
I think that, all school staff, including white folks, but white folks maybe needing to pay special attention to biases they may have, but some, people of color also may have biases even against people of color. So everyone needs to check their biases. But I think, one of the ways that we can prevent sex trafficking is by paying attention to our students that have vulnerabilities and stop seeing kids acting up as just them acting up for the hell of it, or because they're just trying to torture someone, or because they're just a bad seed. When kids act up, like my colleague said, thank you, like they're communicating. They're communicating. It's their noise that they make to say, I need help, something's going on, something's off of alignment. So if we pay attention to that, then that will give us a big sign to be able to intervene before it gets to the point of sex trafficking. So it's really important that we don't start to get so attached and so comfortable with our students who are thriving and who are doing well and who don't give us problems, and that we understand that all of our students need attention, including those that are thriving, but also including those that seem to give us problems but actually have their own problems.
Thank you for that, Nola. This is Johanna Thompson with National Black Women's Justice Institute and the Trauma Informed Schools Learning Network. I wanted to add to that it's also really important with limited resources, kind of like what Toby was speaking about, that schools also establish pathways and processes for young people that are acting out that look a little different than the methods of discipline that we're using now. So if a young person is acting out, having a place where they can then address the behavior before there's disciplinary things instituted, or when a young person does show up at school that is not in uniform, and most of our schools, I'm speaking from South Florida, most of our schools are uniformed. When they don't show up, it's not just an automatic suspension, send you back out into the street, where then you can pick up with continuing to be trafficked. So we do have to think about making sure that we have really strong pathways established within the schools with our limited resources that would help to capture and hold some of those young people in space and create a more safe environment for them. Additionally, and kind of in line with that, I'm thinking about our foster or dependency care demographic of young people who might have moments of time when they don't even get to show up at school because something is happening with the courts, because they're being transferred from one place to another, or because they don't have very consistent placement. And when you see that type of young person going through that process, it's really hard to coordinate care when they are victims of trafficking. So I'm just wondering with our experts if there's any thought process around that, because they unfortunately may have an opportunity to maintain the relationship with the person that's trafficking them, but then they don't have any consistent space or place where they can be held because they're not showing up at school. And then that isn't the place where they can be held in safety. So I'm trying to think.
If they do show up at school, even if it's for 5 minutes, how do we treat them? Right? Because That's the difference, because there is a lot of concerns about that stability and us having that chance to build those relationships. But even if we're building the relationship a couple of minutes at a time, how are we using those couple of minutes to make them feel shameful, to make them feel rejected, or to make them feel loved and cared about, and that we're concerned and that we're not judging them? So it's like, even if we're only seeing them for a short period of time, people have said stuff to me when I was a kid being abused that it took them 30 seconds to say that has stayed with me until this day, and I'm in my 40s. So it's like, how are we going to use that time to either build them up or break them down more?
Exactly. I just want to co-sign on that, because, and that's what I was saying, never make the student who is a child. We have to remember, these are children, never making them feel wrong. They're coming to school because they know that school is generally a safe place, a place that they can get some level of support. So no matter the few minutes that they may be coming, if they're only there for one class period, then you see them going out. They were there, we welcomed them, we supported, we asked what was needed. The policy just became on campus that whenever you would see this particular student or this group of students, that to always be welcoming. Do not say, oh, you have to go to the office, you have cuts to clear, absences to fix and all that. Do not send them through those stressors. Keep them on campus at school as long as possible.
Thank you. One other question that I would have, Tovi, is following up on some of the things that you've said, is what behaviors have you seen at school that are related to Black girls that affect this issue?
In terms of trafficking, sometimes coming to school in party dresses, club dresses, coming to school in the same clothes more than one day in a row, coming to school without any type of academic supplies. Like, they're at school, but there was no backpack, there's no books in the hand, there was nothing that said I was intending to really come to school. Those are definitely key signs, and some behaviors. Extreme fatigue at school. So definitely wanting to fall asleep. Also high agitation, which is generally because of the stress and the fatigue. So the outbursts can be more frequent or more extreme off of a very minor stressor or no stressor, in terms of what was the agitation that's being given by the adult or just by another student. And then behaviors just in general that I know that teachers are very concerned about, that often mention is, and it's been said before, loud, boisterous behavior, what people might say, just really acting hyphy, just really being out there, seeming that something is wild. So a lot of, I think, emotions that are really escalated. And I see such high escalation of emotion as a cover-up for the crap that they are really feeling and really dealing with. It's almost like the phrase, to laugh to keep from crying. So they're just acting so ostentatious, so happy, so loud, that it's really covering up the somberness, the sadness, the aggravation, the pain.
Hey, it's Holly. I would just add to all of that amazingness that sometimes trauma impacts people in the opposite way, right? Like when your prefrontal cortex, when your amygdala is impacted in a way that you end up disassociating completely from what's been happening to you, so that you can show up completely flat and basically have no kind of outward emotions, and even be able to report things that are so horrendous for adults to hear in a way that almost sounds like it can't be possible, because it sounds like she has literally no connection to what it is that she's saying. So I think, like, just making sure that we also are paying attention to the folks that are quiet and super withdrawn and all of those type of expressions as well, because the loudness and kind of the hyphiness is often associated with Black girls, but making sure that we're also seeing folks that may be showing up in the opposite way.
Thank you for saying that, Holly, because I was the other Black girl that you're talking about. And so what they didn't notice is that when it was break time and lunchtime, and I should have been being loud actually, and I should have been doing the things the other girls from my community did, I was sitting in the corner with the book, either reading or pretending to read. And that was one of the things that my trafficker noticed about me, was he noticed the isolation. You know what I mean? So that is very true. I was an honor student. Like I said, I worked in the dean's office. Most of my classmates, as a matter of fact, weren't Black because of the classes that I was in, and where I went to school in San Francisco, most of my classmates were actually Asian. You know what I mean? And so that is so true. And I'm glad that you said that, because what was said is also true by our other colleagues. So no doubt about that at all. But there is, this exception. And I did spend a chunk of my childhood, about 7 years, my mom married a white man, and we lived in the Valley. And then we came back to the city, right into the hood. And so, I always had this part of me, that was not like 100% like the average Black girl. And that played out in how I showed up in environments. And so it made them treat me nicer because I was just quieter, but it didn't help them notice my trauma more, or be more concerned or compassionate about the intergenerational aspect of what I was experiencing. My mom was talked about that in front of me by, school staff and administrators when she didn't respond to phone calls. And so those things still happen, but I was just easier to deal with because I was quieter. I wish I would have been a little bit louder. Like I am now.
I so have to co-sign on that. I really appreciate you, Holly, for bringing it up, because it's so true. And then with what Nola's sharing, I have a similar background. I grew up around white people. That's why I can code switch in between both worlds so well. When my mother died, I ended up at Inglewood High School, and I was that overachieving Black girl who was in a lot of pain, who was doing things I should not have been doing between 14 and 17, but covered it up by being the cheerleading captain and being in the honors classes and being in the top 10 of my class. So what I like to call in the field too, around some of our behaviors, around the schemas that we carry, that we developed at a young age, is this thing around performativity, that we are using quality performance, like doing well. That is the cover up for other things oftentimes. One, it's a positive outlet for us, but at the same time, it's masking other things because people don't notice, because we're doing what we're being asked to do. We're showing up in the ways that people expect us to show up as quality students. And so that too, there are just signs. And I know it gets hard when we start sending you mixed messages, that there are all these nuances of these signs. But that's why it's so important too to connect with students, because you'll start to see things that might be out of the norm for some of the behaviors, and just paying more attention. And I know that it's hard. I had a school with 1,700 kids, but we're talking about humanizing a system.
And some things you're only going to notice. And so that I wanted to loop back around to that. And actually some of your presentation was, in order to be able to have a relationship with the students that's going to allow us to be able to see these things, our relationship with ourselves has to be good. And in order for our relationship with ourselves to be good, regardless of how short the budget is and how long the day is and how many students we have to take time for ourselves and take care of ourselves and do the things that give us life and bring us joy and give us passion, and spend time with ourselves and self-reflection. From that place of having a solid relationship with ourselves, we can then have relationships, well, first of all, like our spouses and our own children, but then beyond that, we can have relationships with the children in our school environments that will allow us to be able to see these, what we're calling nuances, but are really just things about people that we get to know as we build relationship with them, but we can't extend beyond ourselves. And so if you're not doing that, then it's like, go back to square one, and then everything we said is after that.
Jay, can you unmute yourself? I see that you're talking.
Trying. Okay, there we go. Thank you for that very robust conversation. I think that that's hugely important to really talk about being able to develop relationships with young people, and also being very observant. So having one side identifying young people that might have disruptive behaviors, but being able to measure that on their typical behavior, or having students that are like always doing exceptionally well, and that being a mask. So really being able to, with all of the things that teachers do have to do in the class, having opportunities to really build and develop relationships with their young people. I think that that's paramount and instrumental in helping to create safe spaces. There's another question that we have, and I hope I do not mess up your name, from Zinat Haji. And the question is, have you seen something like an in-school support group be creative or be effective? And then they go on to say, we want survivors to have a sense of safety, and a lot of times, especially for young people in schools, that means confidentiality. So would you recommend a group at all? If not, have you seen a capacity for a school-based helpline to take in confidential questions, outreach for support? So it looks like a school group to be effective if it's, and speaking to the confidentiality of the young people, and then what are the different mechanisms to be able to create a support group with confidentiality included?
So I would say, I mean, support groups are one thing, but I would say educational groups like psychoeducation, where all kids, whether they've been affected or whether they haven't been affected, can learn about issues like this. I would say that's more important, because we don't just need to develop support, which is important. We also need to develop empathy, which is equally as important for those individuals in this society. So I would say psychoeducation groups that touched on this issue of sexual abuse should be happening at every school, given the statistics on how many kids experience sexual abuse by the age of 18 in this country. In terms of support groups, I think those can be good when done by a clinician and when there is a lot of concern about confidentiality, because that could be rough for kiddos when they're part of a support group and that information gets out. It can also be rough if they're part of a support group and teachers on campus aren't educated on the topic, and so they have nowhere to continue the conversation.
And thank you so much. Oh, I was going to ask.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, Holly, I was going to ask, what does that look like in regards to school resource officers and or in the work that you did in the past going undercover, what that looks like as far as helping young people to get to a place of safety if they do find themselves victims?
Okay, I'll try to answer that question in just 1 second, but I wanted to give NOLA a particular shout out, because she does have a specific prevention curriculum that we've used in Oakland Unified School District to create socio-emotional learning support groups, small groups. And the way we did it, I mean, I think the curriculum is extremely flexible. All of the feedback that we got on this prevention curriculum from young people was really, really positive. And we did like pre and post surveys around their understanding of trafficking as an experience, their understanding of grooming techniques, etc., before and after, and we always had extremely positive outcomes. So I really want to make sure that I say that that is a tool that's already been developed by NOLA, and it's called Word on the Street, and we did implement it inside Oakland Unified School District. And the way that we did it in a school district that has a bankrupt budget is that, you know, we had Oakland Unified School District partner with Missy, so a community-based organization that then went out and got the grant to be able to bring the curriculum into the school. And we haven't been able yet to have it reach all students, but the way that we've done it is for students to self-select in based on their own assessment of either their interest or their risk, and then also allow teachers, parents, and all administrators to make referrals, and then those students can either decide to opt in or not based on those referrals. So I just wanted to make sure that I said that, because, you know, there are resources out there that schools can use if they are trying to create support groups, which I would definitely encourage. And then to the other question about policing, can you repeat that one again, please?
Let me unmute my mic. So as it relates to school resource officers in the space with young people, what can that look like in creating safe spaces. And I just don't remember all of the language because I was listening to what you were saying about the curriculum. But it was really around the presence of and what we consider our ideologies around what safety looks like, and how school resource officers are being used within the schools, that we can make sure that we are creating safe spaces for the young people who might be victims.
I mean, the reality about like policing in general in this country, right? And this is not just about school resource officers, but it's that we're at this place where, you know, we're having a reckoning about like what policing was, what the roots of policing were, and those oppressive roots, and how those are continuing to show up, particularly in communities of color, right? And the larger discussion about the war on drugs and how that war on drugs was launched in communities of color when white communities actually are showing up in the research to use drugs at larger and sell drugs at greater rates than people of color, right? And so we're having a conversation about policing and what 21st century policing really needs to look like and what communities of color need. And that's people that have more social work skills, right? I mean, 75% of the calls for service that I went to as a police officer really needed either a social worker or a police officer that had social work skills. And that's just not how law enforcement is being trained. 75% of the training in law enforcement is focused on you know, shooting and driving and taking people down and arresting people and understanding the law. And that it's not a match for like what the actual needs of the community are and what the actual job is. And so I think just kind of applying that larger frame to school resource officers, I would say, number one, in my personal opinion, I don't think those are the right people to be there. I think that we should be putting our effort and our money and our resources into having more social workers and counselors and therapists, et cetera, on campus. But again, going back to my earlier point, that if that's the model that you have and you're unable to undo that model right this moment, then there has to be an understanding about what the officers' roles are, and that has to be very specifically mapped out, and then the officers need specific training. But really, unless it has to do with like physical safety and safety of the school campus, because that's why our excuse as a nation for putting school resource officers into schools was really in response to school shootings, right? And then number one, they're not really being utilized in the areas that mass school shootings have most often historically taken place, which is suburban, mainly white areas. They're being flooded into urban environments. And then we're not utilizing them for like school security measures. We're utilizing them for school discipline. And so I would just say they need to really stay in their lane. I mean, like if we're saying that we need school resource officers on campus, then they should be there for the physical safety and security of the school and the students. They don't really have a place in school discipline or interacting with students in the ways that they are currently.
And can I add, we are, like Holly said, there may be some schools where they have that model and they have to keep that model. Then we need to recognize that, like any other professional, a police officer is not God. A police officer is not guaranteed to be good just because they're a police officer. And like any other person, we would be cautious around the children and making sure it's the right person to be around the children, making sure of that with not only school resource officers, but also school security guards. Because you know what? The security guard at my school, he was a pretty nice guy. And I probably would have told him that the cop was trafficking me, except for he was in a relationship with the senior. So given that, even though he was nice and he never had been inappropriate to me, I knew he was inappropriate because he was in a relationship with the senior. So I didn't tell him about the police officer. So both the police officer and the security guard at my school should have been someone the administrator should have seen and recognized as being inappropriate, because a lot of the behavior was really overt, but it wasn't recognized and kids were getting victimized, you know, myself being one of them, but not only me. And so I think if those folks are going to be in the school, not giving them absolute power, just because you're afraid when a cop stops you to get a ticket doesn't mean you don't protect kids at the school and keep them safe, even if it's from the police. And this is not to say all police are trying to hurt kids, but if there are ones that are trying to do it, are we just going to, you know, put our hands up because they're the cops? Or are we going to have the same scrutiny over them as we would over any adult, especially an adult who's not in the school maybe as regularly as the other teachers that we know better? And are we going to try to build a relationship with this cop like we do with our other colleagues so that we feel comfortable with them and their relationship and interactions with the students? So I think those are all things to think about, because I think in my situation, no one looked at the cop. He had absolute power, and they never would have even known it was the cop. I wrote the dean a letter thinking that she was my friend, which she actually was, telling her about it, being like, officer so-and-so, well, he's actually my boyfriend. So I had to tell him. That's the only way they ever found out, or they never would have found out my whole high school career. So looking at everyone around the kid, including the law enforcement folks, and scrutinizing them.
And I can definitely echo a lot of what Nola's naming, seeing it as a student and even as an administrator, and at times feeling intimidated as a school administrator by the school resource officer on my own campus. And they just have a nuance of how they're able to exert that intimidation. I'm not trying to excuse it. I'm sure it was linked to some of my own stuff around police and safety. And at the same time, there's really, there's not the same teamness that I think needs to be there around school resource officers in school, coming from a place of we're serving kids and keeping a place safe. They're bringing in very much a highway patrol mentality a lot of times into a school setting. There's no reason that school resource officers need to walk your campus daily with guns and expect students to want to go to them, feel safe around them. I often would ask my school resource officer to take off his belt, and it became an ongoing battle. I asked my school resource officer to stop parking his car in front of my high school, because it lends itself to the community seeing, oh, that's that school. They always have the police there. Well, he works there. He has an office there. But when he's the only car parked in front of my entire school and everyone else is parked in the parking lot, it makes it look like he's quote unquote above the law, and that we need this police presence at our school, which is the school for kids of color in the district. And so it just really lends itself to some other types of conversations that need to happen. The good old boys network vibe between police officers and the campus security. Definitely the familiarity of campus security with girls. I just think across the board, if you're a campus supervisor and you're over 30-something years old, you should not be at a high school campus as a man, because I've seen too much of the flirtatiousness happening with the 18-year-old girls, the 17-year-old girls, and this campus supervisor just graduated from the same school 2 years ago. So he's feeling a sense of camaraderie that should not be there, nor is it age appropriate in a lot of ways. And so I just appreciate you pointing that out, Nola, and it's a very real issue as well as we work on this sexualization of our girls and the types of roles that some of the men play on campus that don't work hand in hand.
Right. So that goes back to when we're talking about the sexualization of girls, and Holly, I'm trying to understand from a law enforcement perspective and the history that you had, what are the thought processes about how law enforcement can support survivors of sex trafficking while they're being victimized? Do you know what I mean? Like, so during that moment in time when you were undercover, what were like some of the processes? Or like, how did you handle, the 14-year-olds that were being sex trafficked when you were undercover? Like, what was the relationship there with the police institution?
And if I could just intervene, Holly, really quickly, I just am keeping my eye on the time. We're going to wrap up in just a few minutes. So while Holly is answering that question, I just want to invite all of you. You have an unprecedented opportunity to ask questions of these amazing experts. So please do ask us questions if you have any. But do go ahead, Holly. Sorry to delay you.
Yeah, I mean, I think Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. It's a huge question, and since I only have a couple of minutes, I'm going to just try and just give a couple of bullet points. I think uh, all of my understanding about the roles and responsibilities of law enforcement in anti-trafficking work have come from my experiences of making a lot of mistakes. Okay, so let me say that. When I first started the work, we were still arresting 12 and 13 and 14-year-old girls for their own victimization. And part of that, the biggest problem with that was our own mental models about what was going on and how best to protect them and what our role was. We really had the mentality that we are saviors, right? In this kind of savior complex of, as long as we get her and we take her to juvenile hall and she's somewhere where she cannot be in the environment, then we're providing some type of assistance. And then the other part of that was that the other social supports and the other social systems that were really supposed to be in place to be helpful, like child welfare, like community-based nonprofit organizations that we could partner with, didn't exist at that time. So it really was like a police issue. Number one, because we thought it was, and number two, because in reality, child welfare, we were calling at 3 o'clock in the morning after identifying a girl who was being trafficked, whose parent was unable to come and pick them up, and child welfare was telling us that it wasn't their issue unless the parents were involved in the trafficking, right? And so it was both a function of our mental models as law enforcement and just the ways in which society were set up and not set up to be able to respond. So that was 15 years ago, and we've made progress as a country and as a state. I'm in California, but it's very hit or miss because I've been all over the country working with law enforcement around how they interact with and understand trafficking and what their responses are. And some folks have safe harbor laws and some folks don't. And some law enforcement are understanding that their role really should just be in identifying trafficked youth and then pairing that trafficked youth with the resources and help that they need. I mean, that really should be what, in my opinion, law enforcement's role is. It's an identification, and then it's a matching with mental health, community-based organizations, family supports, whether that has to be child welfare, and even making sure that young person is able to receive medical care. It's really like a holistic understanding that you are really just a pass-through organization. And it's important for law enforcement, obviously, as the first point of contact within systems, to also be treating that young person as a survivor and as a victim, as they would a survivor of domestic violence, or as they are trained a survivor of sexual abuse in general. I mean, part of the issue is that you can go through the entire police academy in this country and in this state and never hear anything about sex trafficking. And all your training is around responding to victims of, traditional sexual abuse and responding to domestic violence survivors. But when you start interacting with survivors of sex trafficking who are 12 and 13 years old and who have had to be in survival mode on the streets, they don't present in the way that law enforcement is trained that victims are supposed to present. And then it becomes this really difficult issue for law enforcement to even identify survivors as survivors and victims, because the presentation is contrary to the training that they've received in the police academy about what victimization looks like. So I could obviously go on forever, but I also see the way you're looking at me in our time. So I'm going to stop there, and hopefully that was a bit helpful just to kind of start a conversation about law enforcement.
That was wonderful, Holly. Thank you.
Can I add one thing, Rebecca, about intersectionality? Because it is that the training, but it's also the intersectionality of the commercial sex industry with other biases that the officers have around race and class and gender. So yes, I think it is the training and the commercial sex industry being a little non-traditional to the average victim, but then there's the intersection of that victimization and who they are in life. And I think that's a big part of how we see the different response with law enforcement, with a lot of, at least our Black girls. And I've stood shoulder by shoulder and watched these responses as it pertains to children who look different ways. And I've seen how our Black girls are responded to. I stood shoulder by shoulder with law enforcement for years.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Just to make sure that I say, Nola, 100%. I've seen over the years a response to a missing 13-year-old Black girl not be a call out and not be a priority, and a response to a missing 13-year-old white girl runaway be basically all hands on deck and every investigator called in until that person is found. So I absolutely agree with you. Thank you for pointing that out.
So it seems only fitting for us to allow the last comment to be from our youth advisor herself. As a young woman, Kyla, I think you had something to say, so I want to invite you to go ahead and do that.
Whether, and oh, I'm unmuted. Okay, awesome. I just wanted to ask if whether empowerment workshops or maybe even a healthy relationship course could be a more inclusive option for educating students. I know that the first time I was told I was trafficked was by the detective who conducted the sting operation. And so just knowing that this is going on, I mean, you know, you have these ideas in your head, but it's completely different when someone says this is trafficking. Do you guys think this could be implemented in schools, or maybe should it be something outside of schools?
Thank you. So 20-second lightning round. And then we'll
Yes,
have to go.
absolutely. Yes, 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 yes. We have to get teachers and other supporters on the school level that are kind of groups, but absolutely yes.
And Tovi says yes, absolutely.
Awesome. Awesome, ladies.
Excellent. Wow, this is a super robust and fantastic meeting. I think that we had a really, really great conversation. I'm really excited to see our youth advisor stepping up and asking questions, and everyone speaking, you know, truth to power about this really, really serious topic. Some of the things that I've received from this space is that we really do have to be intentional about developing our relationships, developing our systems and our processes within the schools, specifically language and education around sex trafficking and who is the greatest impacted communities, so that they can be uplifted in the environment and these issues addressed and then prevented. We got to abolish it, smash it, and get rid of our young people being at risk. So thank you so much for all of our participants on the line that have stayed on for the entire duration of this conversation. And we look forward to further communication and conversation. The whole purpose of the Trauma-Informed Schools Learning Network is that we can continue to have these conversations, share best practices, and then be able to have some transformation in community. So we're very, very thankful.
And John, I also wanted to add, this video will be posted as a resource in our learning network. We can always continue the conversation in our discussion board. And please feel free to email or post there if you have any thoughts, questions, feedback. So thank you all for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Have a great day.
Thank you.